Frank Castle's not trying to earn redemption. He is what happens when grief stops looking for a way back and turns punishment into the only life left. Before the skull became one of the most recognizable symbols, Frank was a husband, a father, a decorated soldier who came back from the war. Welcome back, Panelheads. This is our Get to Know Anti-Hero Edition. Today we're breaking down where the Punisher began, how Frank Castle grew far beyond the idea of a gun-toting vigilante, and why justice looks much colder when it comes from a man who stopped believing there's a life waiting for him outside the mission. Frank Castle's first appearance comes in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 129, where he enters as an enemy of Spider-Man instead of a straightforward hero. The Punisher is introduced as a man manipulated by the Jackal and believing Spider-Man deserves to die. He is so focused and convinced that he's aiming himself at evil, but he has one of the most frightening weaknesses a vigilante could have: full certainty before the full truth is in front of him. We wouldn't get a deeper backstory until Marvel Preview Issue 2, where his military service and the murder of his family becomes central for the man behind the skull. He was a proud Marine, a loving husband, and a father whose life was destroyed when his family was killed by a mob violence. This tragedy takes away the only life he knew how to live outside of war. One often overlooked detail about Punisher is that Frank Castle does not want followers. In The Punisher Issue 13, Frank confronts police officers who adopted his skull symbol because they admire what he does. But instead of treating that as a respect, he immediately shuts it down. Frank makes it clear that they took an oath to uphold the law, while he's given up that a long time ago. Frank Castle knows he's not an example others should follow. He's simply the consequence of a failing system, not some model for how the system should behave. Frank can live with the criminals fearing the skull, but he does not want ordinary people, officers, or copycats turning that into a badge of honor. His first solo limited series, The Punisher Issue 1 in 1986, pushes the idea further by placing Frank at the center of his own world. In Circle of Blood, the story begins with Frank behind bars and pulls him into the conflict with the Trust, a group that wants to use his war for their own agendas. Punisher Max Issue 1, Frank moves into a darker crime war story that leans harder into the trauma, corruption, and the cost of a life spent killing. This is where the Punisher becomes the more brutal crime character standing inside the consequence of his own life. Well, I'd love to show a little bit more. It's definitely more explicit material, so I'd recommend checking it out right after this video. Later during the War Machine era, in The Punisher Issue 218, Frank gets access to the War Machine armor, and the question becomes much louder. What happens when a man so committed to permanent punishment gets one of the most destructive weapons? For Frank Castle, relationships are difficult as most people get close enough to witness the damage or become proof that there is still a person buried somewhere. Rachel Cole-Alves gives the Punisher a contagious reflection. In The Punisher Issue 12, we see Frank doesn't comfort Rachel's grief. He strips away the keepsakes and the memories, forcing her to make a decision whether she's trying to live or fully giving herself up to the mission. Rachel wears the warning of what it is to lose to follow Frank's road. If the mission becomes everything, then even the life you are avenging has to be buried along with the dead. Daredevil is not just a hero Frank runs into. He is placed at the very center of Frank's entire moral argument. In Daredevil issues 183 and 84, their first real clash is not about stopping some drug dealer. It is about what justice is allowed to become when the system keeps letting people slip through it. To Frank, removing the criminal means preventing the next victim. To Matt, killing the criminal creates a fallout that spreads beyond the body on the floor. And this is exactly what makes their relationship so heavy. Every time Daredevil and Punisher collide, both men sound right to make the other terrifying. Frank Castle does not collect villains the way Spider-Man or Daredevil does. A lot of the people who cross him become warnings, but his most personal threats survive him. Billy Russo, Jigsaw, is one of the few enemies who feels like a nightmare Frank Castle created with his own hands. In Punisher Year 1, Billy's the hitman Frank leaves behind after the massacre of his family, creating Jigsaw into the living warning sign to the criminal world. The problem is, Frank leaves something behind much more twisted. And every time Jigsaw comes back, it feels like the consequence of one punishment Frank did not finish. In The Punisher, issues 1 through 12, better known as Welcome Back, Frank, Ma Gnucci is introduced as organized crime with a temper, and with enough brutality to make New York feel like a hostile territory. She isn't a costume supervillain trying to rule the world. She's part of the crime world, refusing to die quietly after Frank starts tearing through it. Frank takes her family and her family's empire, but Ma Gnucci's hatred keeps reaching back for him. She becomes another prime example that the Punisher's personal war does not only erase enemies, sometimes it creates something much more vicious. In a world with gods, mutants, and magic, the Punisher survives through training, discipline, and an intense willingness to go further than most heroes ever would. Frank's military background gives him the understanding of weapons and psychological pressure points. He does not walk into a room hoping the fight goes his way. He studies the room, controls the angles, and ends the fight before the target can react, and his pain tolerance is on a whole nother level. Frank gets hurt constantly, but the pain rarely stops him from coming for you. He isn't invincible. His relentless tenacity almost makes him feel inhuman. In Spider-Man, the animated series, Frank appears where the show uses him as a darker force inside of Spider-Man's world. The Punisher is anchored as the idea he doesn't believe criminals deserve restraint. Later in Avengers Confidential, Black Widow and Punisher pairs Frank with Black Widow on a SHIELD mission against Leviathan and stolen technology. Live action has given fans many different versions from over the years. Dolph Lundgren's 1989 The Punisher leans into the grim one-man army version of the character, while Thomas Jane's 2004 The Punisher spends more time with the man who survives the murder of his family and slowly becomes the Skull. Punisher Warzone in 2008 with Ray Stevenson pushes Frank into a comic book crime world with Jigsaw as the main villain. Jon Bernthal's version has become the modern benchmark. His debut in Daredevil Season 2 makes him collide with Matt Murdock's moral code, and the Punisher series dives deeper into the military trauma, Billy Russo, Micro, and whether or not Frank has any life left outside the mission. Jon Bernthal's Frank returns in Spider-Man Brand New Day, bringing the character back into the larger spotlight while keeping him tied to the street-level world where his story hits hardest. Video games has been the easiest place to understand the Punisher on the surface. Weapons, tactics, targets. The 2005 Punisher game, with Thomas Jane returning to voice the character, focuses on the gameplay and brutal street-level crime. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 later brings him into the Marvel Knights, placing him alongside Blade, Moon Knight, and Morbius. Then, Marvel Rivals turned Frank into a playable DPS, built around his arsenal and the one-man army identity that makes him instantly understandable in a team shooter. Across the games, I will say that the harder part is capturing the quiet weight behind all of it, that the why the mission is so important to him versus anyone else. In modern comics, Punisher Red Band Issue 1 brings back the damaged memories, the violent search for answers, and the darker representation built around more mature content. Punisher Issue 1 2026 keeps the same setup and the focus where it belongs. Frank Castle's a man haunted by his past as much as by his enemies. Frank Castle is what happens when grief stops looking for a way back and turns punishment into the only life left, forcing the same question back into the room. When the system fails, how far can someone go before justice becomes something else entirely? So, panelists, who should I cover next? Kingpin? Spider-Man? Rachel Cole-Alves? Or someone else entirely? And if I brought up a detail you didn't know, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with another comic book fan. Let's keep building this Panelhead community together. Other than that, Panelheads, we will see you again when we cover another one of our favorite comic book anti-heroes from over the years.